Hello, everyone. I'd say good evening, since this is a Wednesday night Bible study, but Ken Laux has graciously brought all the equipment over to the house, and it's actually Sunday morning, so a little early. A long time since we've seen everyone. We were gone a good chunk of the summer to Texas to take care of our daughter-in-law during her cancer surgery, and off to the feast, which is a long story in itself that I won't take time. We had the delight of spending the feast in Alaska with friends that we've known for many, many, many years. And then we'll be gone most of the rest of this year to take care of the grandkids and the granddaughter as she prepares at the very end of this month for a second surgery. So we've missed seeing you, except occasionally flitting by the camera on Sabbath services or the visits we've had or the emails we've exchanged. But it's nice to spend a Bible study with you. I'd like to, during this Bible study, I would like to cover the incident that is recorded in Mark chapter 12 and in Matthew chapter 22 regarding Jesus Christ's conversation with the scribe about the Great Commandment of the law. It's a very interesting conversation, and more than I think most realize, there's a considerable amount of depth to the conversation between Christ and the scribe. And we'll dissect that conversation, break it down into its pieces, so you can appreciate what all was going on between the two of them. First of all, we look at the biblical accounts, and in one gospel, the man who asked the question is called a scribe. That's in the account of Mark. And in Matthew's account, he is called a lawyer. But neither one of these terms, scribe from Mark or lawyer from Matthew, really captures the full sense of what this man was. There were different levels of understanding of law within the Jewish community and among Jewish leadership, just as there is today in America among those who are trained in law. To give you a comparison, in United's history, we have had men in leadership positions who held a JD degree, which is a Juris Doctorate, and they were a doctor of the law. And while that may sound like the pinnacle of legal understanding, it is in fact just the first rung on a rather unusual ladder. Those who know the academic world know that the normal progression is from a bachelor's to a master's to a doctorate. But the Juris Doctorate, or Doctor of the Law degree, is followed, next rung up the ladder, by a master's degree. It's a LLM, or a Master of Law, and it's actually a higher degree than the Juris Doctorate. In fact, you have to have the Juris Doctorate in order to begin the schooling necessary to get a Master of Law. At the very pinnacle of law degrees in the United States is an SJD, which stands for a Doctor of Judicial Science. So there are three rungs on the ladder in our nation: a Juris Doctorate, a Master's, and then a Doctor of Judicial Science. I take the time to go through that because there were different levels of understanding of the law in Christ's day also. A number of Pharisees probably prided themselves in their understanding of the laws. Their understanding would have included oral law. But this man was, if we deal with the equivalents, this man would be the equivalent of a SJD, a Doctor of Judicial Science. His specialty was not Pharisaical tradition or oral law. His entire training, his entire schooling, and his entire life focused on the nature, the structure, and the content of the laws of God. as the Jewish people would refer to those 5 books, the Torah. And so the first thing to understand as we look into that conversation was this was a man who had spent, however long he'd been alive, had spent his entire life focused on the study of the nature, the structure, and the internal content of the laws of God. Second thing to look at when we move into Mark chapter 12 is the nature of the conversation. All of us are aware of the fact that most of Christ's conversation with Jewish leaders were adversarial. It doesn't take a lot of time before we realize that he was baited, he was goaded, he was set up with set-up questions. And so most of his time and most of his experience dealing with leaders, and it didn't matter whether they were Pharisees or Sadducees, most of his conversations were adversarial in nature as they tried to find ways to embarrass Christ or to demonstrate in some way that he was a fraud. Matthew says that the conversation with the scribe was one where he came testing him, which by the very nature of that word seems to be the introduction to just another adversarial conversation. But commentators commenting on Mark's account notice the lack of adversarial conversation. When you look at their conversation, there's nothing adversarial in the short description of the conversation itself. And probably even more telling is at the end of the conversation, there is no condemnation from Christ of the scribe. So you don't see adversarial terminology in the conversation between the two of them, and you don't see Christ condemning the scribe. In fact, Christ has a rather positive response where he says, you're very close. You're very close to grasping and understanding the Great Commandment of the law. Testing, in this case, may have been a genuine desire to see how deep this person, speaking of Christ, just how deep this person's knowledge was of the nature of biblical law. He did, as he posed the question, address Christ as master, giving him or at least implying that he was giving him the respect of a peer, someone who could discuss on his level the deeper elements of the laws of God. So the indications are this was quite likely the deepest of conversations between two experts on biblical law. Thirdly, those who don't realize how well-schooled this man was in biblical law can think he posed a somewhat childish question. It is, when people have not studied this very deeply, it can appear that he was just simply saying, well, here are the 10. Now, create a ladder for me and tell me which one of the 10 is at the top of the ladder. That wasn't even remotely what the conversation was about. The scribe wanted to know how deeply Christ understood the underpinnings of biblical law, how deeply he grasped and understood its guiding principles. Ironically, and the day will come where we will all get a chance to smile, he didn't know he was talking to the author of those laws. So when it came to his question, there will be a day, I am sure, in the resurrection where this man finds out who he was talking to. And there will be nothing but awe, admiration, and humility. Now, these things provide the context for Christ's answer. The stature of the man who posed the question, the nature of the conversation that does not appear to be an adversarial conversation, but one probing depth, And thirdly, the fact that it just simply wasn't about whether 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 is at the top, but it was about the principles and the underpinnings of law as a body that he was probing. So let's enter into the conversation. Let's, since we've been talking about it all this time, let's actually read it. The account spans the space between Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. So if we want to read the whole thing, this will give us the entire setting. Mark chapter 12 and verse 28, then one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceived that he had answered them well, and asked him, which is the first commandment of all? And so he'd already watched Christ deal with those who wanted to debate with him, and he was impressed by his answer. So now he asked him, which is the foremost commandment? The marginal reading in the New King James for first is foremost. The header in this section is what is the greatest. And Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And second, like it, is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And so the scribe said to him, well said, teacher, or master. In other words, he gave him a nod of agreement that what he had said was profound. Well said, teacher, you have spoken the truth, for there is one God, and there is no other but him, and to love him with all your heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, so you see compliments going both directions. The Pharisee, the scribe, when he heard him, said, in essence, I'm impressed with your answer. And when he had responded, indicating that he grasped what Christ said, Christ returned that compliment by noting that he had answered wisely, and he said, you're very close. You're not far from the kingdom of God. In other words, you understand very closely what this is all about. So Christ's answer contained, if you look at it, when he was asked, what is the foremost commandment of the law, Christ's answer contained the principles of the Shema, which is considered the essence of Judaism, and he recited the whole of it. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This was that quotation from Deuteronomy 6. But he didn't stop there. He then went on to incorporate Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18, which says that you should love your neighbor as yourself. So he gave that as his answer to the scribe's question, what is the great commandment of the law? Then you see the statement of Christ here in Mark chapter 12, verses 30 and 31, as comprising two vertical elements. Love of God at the top, then after describing in detail, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your might, all your soul, so forth, then stepping down a notch and saying, now love your neighbor as yourself. This isn't what Christ was saying. To see what Christ said as a two-tier vertical structure is to miss the intent of Christ's answer. Let's look carefully at Mark chapter 12 and 31, and let's look at how Christ answered. because in the how, there's an element that is quite telling. He says that there is none other commandment. The end of verse 31, he says, and the second is like unto it, you shall love the neighbor as yourself. And then he concludes everything he said with this statement, there is no commandment greater than these. He doesn't address them as primary and secondary because Christ doesn't see them as vertical, but he sees them as lateral. One is nothing but the extension of the other. You can see things in life as this is important too, but not quite as important. Or you can see things as this is important and this flows to this, and there is a continuum between the two, a lateral nature. Two commentators help grasp the understanding that this was not a vertical conversation, but it was a lateral conversation. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, as he addresses that statement, the second is like, says that when Christ said the second is like unto it, what Christ was saying was the second demands the same affection and is only an extension of it. And so Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown describes the lateral nature that the second one I'm giving you, second portion of the singular Great Command, is like the first element of the singular Great Command, and it demands the same affection, and it is in reality nothing more than an extension of the first. The Cambridge Bible for students and colleges, addressing that same element, the second is like, namely this, says according to the best manuscripts, the reading is, the second is this. To the scribe he names two as forming together the great and first commandment. So he isn't giving two commands, he's giving one command. The question from the scribe, what is the great commandment, singular, was what Jesus Christ was addressing. He didn't ignore the question and say, well, I'm really going to give you two great commands. He said there is only one great commandment, and it has two elements, and one flows from the other. Probably a way of helping or assisting in wrapping your mind around this is to go back to the very end of the New Testament, to the letter of 1 John. Very appropriate that the clarifier should be in 1 John, the apostle known as the apostle that Christ loved, and one who is noted for his writings on love. In 1 John chapter 4, and in verse 21, this is what John has to say. And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his neighbor also. By implication, John is saying the same thing that we described in Mark chapter 12. They are not separate, they are combined, and there is a lateral nature to them. And so as he says, we have this commandment from him. The commandment is, if we love God, then we must love our brother also. And in fact, John doesn't treat them as primary and secondary, but as singular and inseparable. And he makes that point very graphically when he asks the rhetorical question in the preceding verse, in verse 20. He said, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? That's a rhetorical question. What he's really saying is, if you can't love your brother who you do see, then you really can't love the God that you can't see. And so John makes a very graphic point here in these two verses, 1 John 4, verses 20 and 21, that only goes to buttress the point of the conversation between the scribe and Christ in Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. The inseparable nature of the two is emphasized by John. The scribe was impressed with Christ's answer. Christ was kind to him in return. But if this was all we got out of it, we would have missed what both of them knew as experts on Old Testament law. So we can have the little microscopic view of those verses, and we can say, okay, the scribe was not combative. He was a master. Christ also, as the author, was indeed the ultimate master. They compared notes. They were both impressed with their positions, and they both complimented one another. And we could walk away with that, but we wouldn't really have the depth of appreciation that these two had for what they were actually saying. Let's go onward to modern times. We see ourselves as enlightened. In fact, since the philosophical age of enlightenment onward, society has only seen itself as progressively becoming more and more enlightened. And we see ourselves as a time of enlightened governance. The impact of Christ's statement is lost on much of modern Christianity because they have cast the Old Testament as a time of burden, oppressive, and done away. Yet Christ did not see it that way, nor did the Pharisee. The reality is that all the heart and the soul of Old Testament law, which they were describing in its lateral nature, all the heart and the soul of Old Testament law will govern mankind for 1,000 years in the millennium and then beyond. For the laws that God gave to Israel embodied more love of fellow man than any legal code ever created by even the most enlightened era of mankind. Let me say that again. The laws that God gave in the Old Testament regarding love of God and love of fellow man are more enlightened than the most enlightened laws made by any society in mankind's history. Man today sees himself and his laws as enlightened, and in some cases, when you stand back and look at them fairly and objectively, man's laws do display a commendable level of enlightenment when measured by biblical law. And I'll give you some examples so that you can see that there are areas of law where indeed man's sense of enlightenment is legitimate, and his laws are enlightened when compared to the centuries previous. Leviticus chapter 19. Now, this is a simple statement. Obviously, the depth of the laws of God in the Torah are such that we simply can give a single example of points that are covered many times over. So you could find the same principle time and time again between Exodus and Deuteronomy. But we just need a poster child, as it were, to make a point. So in Leviticus chapter 19 and in verse 14, one of the laws that God gave to ancient Israel was, "You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord." So he said, in my law, you don't curse the deaf person, and you don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. In terms of respect for the principle in that particular law, we are indeed enlightened compared to generations past. We've had schools for the blind and the deaf to help train them, educate them, even to give them skills that can give them employment. We have developed Braille and beyond that, electronic books for the blind, freely accessible to them, so that they have a way of learning, a way of being entertained, and a way of gaining knowledge that is free to them. When you go into a city and you see street signs, traffic signs that audibly give a beep so that a blind person knows how long they have to cross a street. When you see graded curbs for wheelchair convenience, as construction crews come in and take down the standard curb and put in can't think of the term, but it's a roughed up surface, so even then it's not slick, which gives a double benefit. Handicap ramps in public buildings so that people can get in and out and have access. Grab bars in lavatories and restrooms. Public transport with hydraulic ramps so that people in wheelchairs are able to get in and out of a bus or a tram or a trolley. These are enlightened. They are simply ways that a society has, whether they know it or not, and whether they care or not. But they are ways that they have of respecting a law that God gave to Israel in Leviticus chapter 19. Let's look at Deuteronomy 25. Here's another area of enlightened governance in societies that consider themselves enlightened. Deuteronomy chapter 25, beginning in verse 13. You shall not have in your bag different weights, a heavy and a light. You shall not have in your house different measures, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure, that your days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. For all such things and all who behave unrighteously are an abomination to the Lord your God. So God says, it is to me an abomination when you have unjust weights and measures. If your scales weigh heavy when you're selling something to someone, and they weigh light when they're trying to sell something to you, God says this is an abomination. You know, we don't pay a lot of attention, but every time you go up to the gas pump, there's an inspection sticker that says, we have periodically come by to see that when this gas pump is running, that when it says a gallon of gas has gone through the system, that it measures a gallon of gas, not 9/10 of a gallon, but a full gallon. We don't see a lot of scales anymore, but in a day where you had mechanical scales in grocery stores, you'd always see a state inspection sticker on the scale that says this scale has been measured, it has been certified, and it weighs correctly. These are enlightened. Manufacturers, it's always humorous because you watch manufacturers and they will take advantage of everything they possibly can to be deceptive. So the spirit of manufacturing and merchandising isn't comparable to the laws that are on the books. We're all familiar with a big box that's only 2/3 full. It does weigh exactly what it says on the box. If you take all the cereal out and put it in a scale, it's going to weigh what the box says it weighs. But to the eye, when you look at a box, it is a third larger than its content. Emotionally, the manufacturer is not being emotionally honest, even though they are obeying the letter of the law. Let's take one more example, Deuteronomy chapter 19. And these are all examples of a society that is enlightened and areas where, you know, you can be down on the world around us to the place where you're not fair. We all know they don't do everything right. In fact, we know very graphically the things they do horribly. But there is within the society that we live in those areas where there is within economic capabilities an attempt to respect some of these laws that reflect on the love of fellow man. Deuteronomy 19 and verse 14, Another Old Testament law says, "You shall not remove your neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have set in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess." So he says, those landmarks which the men of old have set in place, you are not to move them. I live in a subdivision. There's a odd little finger of land that belongs to me that I have never understood why. I have a square lot, but I have a little appendix that shoots off to the side of it that is mine. And I would not have known it had I not seen the little yellow surveyor's stake driven into the ground at the end of this little finger. On the curbs, there are also etchings on the curb that show where the boundaries are. And so I can walk outside and I know exactly where my boundaries are. There's a yellow surveyor's little nubbin in the middle of the street that is in front of my house. There's one at the back of my property on both sides, and there are marks in the sidewalk. I also have a deed where all the surveyor's measurements are there with precision. Nothing unusual, we all have that. It is our way as a society of respecting Deuteronomy 19, verse 14. So these are examples of modern law that demonstrate love of neighbor. And there are others. You could go through Exodus to Deuteronomy, and you find a number of places where there is an attempt, successful to one degree or another, to apply in society by law things that respect our neighbors. There are other modern laws which speak to a heart that puts neighbors right on a par with self, or in many cases the well-being of community, above the disregard of the individual for anyone but self. So, we have particular modern standards which speak to the heart of the issue of putting neighbors' rights on a par with self, and of caring for neighbor as you would care for yourself. Most of those, whether they are by law or simply by directive, I would say some of the best examples are in the area of sanitation. I have on my corner a sewer inlet right on the corner and a manhole covering the sidewalk. This time of year when the leaves are falling, if I'm out doing yard work and I see that's full of leaves, I try to move the leaves away. Because otherwise, since I sit on the cusp of a hill, all the water running by the side of my house is going to either run into the cul-de-sac to my west or down the hill to the south, and neither benefits my neighbor. Our sanitation laws, everything from garbage pickup to waste and sewage treatment, are all ways of keeping what we produce in the way of waste, whether human or industrial, from contaminating our surroundings and affecting our neighbors. And so all of our sewage treatment laws, all of our sanitation standards are all less specific, but nonetheless they are examples of love of neighbor. What is interesting, and where it breaks down, where we understand the nobility of the laws between Exodus and Deuteronomy, and where we see the need for Jesus Christ to come so that man can actually see and experience what it is like to see the Great Commandment in action. The breakdown is that the highest and most noble of the laws God gave Israel, neither they during their time nor we in our time have lived up to. The reality, brethren, in life is that there's a limit to how much self a person is willing to sacrifice for the well-being of his neighbor. in a carnal world, and even among us, if we think carnal-mindedly, there's a limit to how much self we are willing to sacrifice in order to take care of the well-being of a neighbor. You'll remember that the change from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant wasn't because the law had problems, it was because the keepers had problems. As God very graphically stated between Jeremiah 31 and the book of Hebrews, the fault was not with the law, the fault was with the people. And the new covenant came because a new heart is needed in order to keep the great command the way that it should be kept. And that heart wasn't in the Old Testament times, and that heart isn't here today either. Let's look at laws that will be taught and practiced in the millennium that are simply too noble and too enlightened for this carnal world to obey. When you go back to the scribe's conversation with Christ and Christ's answer to the scribe, they understood the nobility of the laws of God, and they understood the frailties of human nature. And in all of that, in all of that was an illustration of a simple fact. There are laws of God regarding fellow man that are simply too noble and enlightened for this carnal world to obey. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 25, and I'll show you one that is, in one sense, more poignant during this time of lockdown and this time of mass unemployment than it would be even in normal times. But in Leviticus chapter 25 and in verse 35, it says, "If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God." One of the laws that demonstrated loving your neighbor as yourself, which Israel didn't obey, and which we break egregiously today, is God said simply, you are not to charge interest to your poor neighbor. If you understand Old Testament law, and a person who is knowledgeable enough about the Bible may say, stop a minute, squint, and say, well, what about the parable where Christ condemned the man who had simply put his money in a sock and said the very least you could have done was to put my money to the money lenders and I would have received interest? If you understand Old Testament law, the essence of it was, if you have a business venture and you need capital, then you may charge interest. If you go to someone and say, I wish to grow a business, I have a business venture, I don't have enough capital, will you lend me money? Then lending at an acceptable rate between the two parties was acceptable to God and to the law. Where it was not acceptable was when your neighbor was in need or in want, and then you charged him interest. We live in a horrible time in that regard, because when it comes to payday loans and when it comes to the interest rate on credit cards, which really, the people that are going to be hit the most by interest rates are not the people who are well off. Any person who understands money management well and is in decent financial shape doesn't carry a balance from month to month. Why in the world would you pay 24 or 25% interest? It's the person who has to live on that credit card, is trying to figure out a way to keep the wolf from the door, who's carrying the balance and being hit by 18, 19, 20, When I look at some of the credit card offers, it takes my breath because I see them in the 23, 24, 25, a quarter of the entire principal in interest per month. From the biblical perspective, if we could coin a term, this would be vulture capitalism, because all it does is pick the bones of the poor, while the person who's well off, he simply pays his balance every month, and he doesn't pay him any interest. There are certain principles that were so noble in Old Testament times that we have no biblical record of continual observance. In fact, we have the question of whether or not there was ever a full and complete observance of one element of it ever. And yet they were part of the law that God gave. Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 1. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. You will be familiar when I start reading it. The very first verse of Deuteronomy 15 really says what needs to be said. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. That was a biblical law. The next 10 verses go on to flesh out verse 1. But every 7 years was to be a time of the release of debt. Now, people who don't know the nature of God's law don't realize that if you were trying to capture the essence of God's law, it was if you have energy, imagination, and drive, and you can prosper from it, then good for you. But if you have to do that on the back of someone else, this is an abomination. So reward for energy and reward for imagination was a part of what God said, good. If you have imagination, if you have energy, then you should be rewarded for it, but not at the expense of your brother. They are separate and distinct elements. When a brother, for instance, sold his land within that 7-year period because he was in debt and needed a loan, both the buyer and the lender calculated what the crops would be in the remaining years, what kind of profit would come from those crops in those remaining years, and then that amount of money was loaned to the individual. And so the person in this particular kind of loan situation was allowed to negotiate a fair arrangement. If I make X number of talents per year off the land, then this is what I can loan you. But God said, as a part of law, which millennially will be law, every 7 years, everybody resets the clock on debt. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 8 through 10. This is the area in Leviticus that talks about the year of release, or Jubilee, every 50th year. If there was a cornerstone, if you could take one law out of all the laws of God that embodied the highest and purest form of love of neighbor as love of self, I don't know of a single individual law that would be more prominent and notable than Leviticus 25, 8 through 10, and really all the way down to verse 23, the year of Jubilee. That no matter how poorly you manage, no matter how poor a manager you are, regardless of whether you're a good manager, how bad the times were that you were unfortunate enough to live in, that simply overwhelmed you despite your skills and abilities at management, every 50 years, we reset the clock to 0, and all property goes back to the original owners. Now, I use the term all property and I put it in quotes because, again, if you are familiar with the laws of God, you understand that these are not Pollyanna. They are simply fairness at a level that man is incapable with a carnal mind of living fairly. Properties sold within cities, within walled cities, were treated in the same way they are today, with a little element of lemon law or remorse law built in. Property within cities was sold back and forth between people at market values. God stipulated that if you were the seller, you did have a set period of time to exercise a remorse law and say, you know, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done that, I want my property back, and to reclaim it. But after that remorse period was over, if you sold a piece of property in a walled city, if you sold a house, you sold a business in a walled city, you now have a transfer of ownership, and it now belonged legally and permanently to the new person, or until they wish to sell it to someone else. But the land and the villages, biblical society, for those of you who have traveled, I've never seen anything that exemplifies the layout better than little towns and communities in Germany, where you go into small remote communities in Germany and people still live in a town, a little hamlet, and they go out from that community and farm the fields around it during the day, and at the end of the day they drive back into the hamlet. Well, those little hamlets and all the land surrounding them in Germany today would be a good mental equivalent to land structure and laws in biblical times. The land could never be sold permanently to anyone else. It stayed in the family. And the little hamlets that they lived in and moved out to work the land around, those always returned to the original owner. And so you couldn't make permanent poverty. The bad decisions or the bad luck of a parent could not be borne upon the shoulders of his children or grandchildren. They got an opportunity to start all over and do it again. These are enlightened laws. There's a sleeper in the Great Commandment principle, one that you would not normally put there. So I've covered the grand ones. I know of no grander ones than the sabbatical year of release and the Jubilee. But I'd like to go, just sideways a little bit and give you a sleeper. Those of you that know your Bible well or know chapters well, if I mention Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, you know what those chapters are. Those are the dietary laws. And you think, okay, God spends all of Leviticus 11 telling me what I should eat, what I shouldn't eat, and he does again in Deuteronomy 14. And though I'm not going to list books, chapters, and verses, there are accompanying washings laws. And we can look at those as, well, that's just, that's really ancient history, and they don't have an applicability today. You touch a dead body, and then you have to wash your clothes and wash your body, and you have to stay away from other people for a day, and we see all these washings, and we just sort of do a tilt and dismiss them. But you need to couple those in there also. As I said, these are love of neighbor laws, but they're sleepers because they don't look that way. But you and I right now are in the best time in all of my lifetime to demonstrate the reality of all of that. We are in the worst combined health/economic crisis of modern times. There really is no parallel to where we are right now in terms of a combined health crisis, which then, by means of domino effect, have created an economic crisis in all of my lifetime. And I doubt even those who've lived long enough to have lived during the Depression would find that much different. What do they do to? What is all the mess that we're in right now in terms of the number of people that have died, the number of societies that lock down or quarantine, the millions who are jobless or on unemployment? What's it all due to? It's due, as we trace it back, it's due to wet markets, which ignore, first of all, any semblance of dietary law. Every creeping, crawling thing that God says is detestable are there in those markets. And they're there in the most unsanitary of conditions. Cage upon cage upon cage, and whatever falls from one cage onto the creatures and the next and the next and the next. And so it is the worst possible combination of ignoring what creatures should be eaten and what conditions they should be kept in. Do you see the love of neighbor element in the dietary laws? You're not going to get a better time looking backward to demonstrate it. And unless things are worse sometime in the future, you're never going to find a time that demonstrates as better than the time that we're living in right now. We get numb to the consequences of such disregard. But I did a Google search, and in the last 30 years, if you do a similar search, if you look for what have been the consequences of eating what we should not be eating and not keeping clean what we should be keeping clean, on the countdown, we are approaching the loss of 50 million lives in the last 30 years that are directly connected to ignoring Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14, and the accompanying sanitary or cleanliness laws that support them. That is loving or not loving one's neighbor on a phenomenal scale. This all leads to the final category. Interestingly, because there are no penalties referenced for disregard to what I'm going to bring up now, these are simply appeals to the highest sense of community and the need to care for your neighbor. Now, these things may sound very New Testament, but the New Testament, as regards moral law, is really nothing but a rehash of Old Testament law. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 22. You know, there are laws which carry penalties, and then there are laws, and we may have to put them in quotes, that are just simply common sense, and that people who care for their fellow man know inherently and intrinsically that I have a responsibility to do this. Sure, I don't have to look over my shoulder and see whether there's somebody who's going to enforce it. I don't have to ask what's the fine if I don't enforce it. But it is a law of common sense. Deuteronomy 22. Here are some, and I have to put it in quote, laws, because you're not going to see a penalty attached to them, but you're going to see a finger shake that says, look, if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, this is the only way you do it. Here are 4 beautiful verses, which in my Bible are entitled, The Law of the Brother's Property. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray, and hide yourself from them. You're not going to see your brother's sheep or his ox go astray and ignore it. Just say, that's not my business. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother. You know, in rural areas, there's enough community that people do that. And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, now we ramp it up a couple of notches. Then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother seeks it, and then you shall restore it to him. Now it's a matter, you got to feed it, and you've got to create a place to keep it. And you don't know how long it's going to be until your brother says, I've looked all over and I can't find my cow or I can't find my sheep. You shall do the same with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garments. With any lost thing of your brother's which he has lost, and you have found, you shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself. What he's saying is, benign neglect is illegal. Hide yourself simply means ignore it. Turn a blind eye. Say, that's not my job, not my responsibility. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift them up again. Those are very noble laws because there's no penalty. There's not a set of laws that you're going to end up in court. But these are those unwritten laws that say that at the level of the heart, you understand. We've laughed in our family on occasion when my mother and father were alive at an incident that simply spoke to how natural that is in little children. And this is a case where, without boasting, it just simply happened to be, I remember it because I was the participant. I think it was the summer of 4 years old. My birthday's in October, so I was late fours. And we lived in a rural area in Idaho, and there was a slight upgrade from our house to the neighbor's house and a gravel road. And they lived probably 100, 150 yards, maybe 200 yards away from us. And I remember standing in front of our house and looking up the hill, and the neighbor had a pig pen. And it was a hot summer's day, and the pigs were in the wallow, and they were hunkered down to take advantage of the cool. But as a 4-year-old, it disturbed me. And so I walked up the hill, and I walked down the farm driveway to the neighbor's house, and I talked to the lady. And I came back home, and my mother had noticed me walking back, and she said, Bobby, where did you go? And the neighbor's name was Tarp. And I said, I told her I went to talk to Mrs. Tarp. And she said, why? What did you say? And I said, I told her pigs were stuck in the mud. And my mother said, well, what did she say? And she told me, because I remember going up, but I don't remember the conversation. She said, you told me that she said she knowed it. But natural, there's an innocence, and I use it only for that example. There's an innocence in children that connects to these 4 verses. Over time, we can get hardened, we can get busy, we can get fearful. It can be any of those things, and we just simply put them aside. We are our brother's keeper. Cain, in a snotty attitude, asked God if he was his brother's keeper, and that embedded it for all of history, the phrase, but we are our brother's keeper, and Deuteronomy 22, the first 4 verses make that point. But the New Testament teaching goes even further. What I just read to you was law without legal penalty. Law that appealed to heart and conscience. In Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ ramped it up a notch. He turbocharged it. So in Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 45, he said, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And we look at that and we say, wow, the New Testament really really ramped the whole thing up. And it's much like the conversation between Christ and the scribe. We see that statement in Matthew 5:43 and 44, and 43 through 45, and we draw a wrong conclusion. We all read, well, you've heard it said you should love your neighbor or hate your enemy. And we say, okay, the Old Testament was this way, but Christ is making it a whole lot better. Well, if that's how you've read it wrong. If you go back to Exodus chapter 23, in Exodus chapter 23, and now we're on the very front end of the laws, aren't we? Because the Ten Commandments were given in chapter 20, so we're still right square in the front end of the time in the wilderness. And if it had been in handwriting, we could use the old saying, the ink wasn't even dry yet on the Ten Commandments, to use a phrase. But in Exodus chapter 23, just 3 chapters later, notice what it says in verse 4. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. You know, the you have heard it said was not you have heard it said within the laws of God. You may have heard it said in your oral traditions or in your carnal attitudes. But what he said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, he had already said to Israel in Exodus chapter 23. Here we see just 2 chapters after the giving of the Ten Commandments, the highest and the most noble application of the Great Commandment. Care not just for neighbor, not just for friend, but care also even for your enemy. You know, as we look at all of this, the scribe could understand and appreciate Christ's answer because both of them understood the law in the deepest sense. That scribe saw a master, one who really had mastered the heart, the intent, and the spirit, and the soul of the law, explain not the great commandments, but the great commandment. He could see it contained the Shema, an expression of the love of God with all one's heart, and he could see how seamlessly it continued on to a demand to love neighbor, and then see it stretch from neighbor even to include one's enemies. This is the great commandment of the law as seen by Christ then. It is how Christ views it now, and it's how Christ and we who will reign and rule with him will administer it in the millennium and the kingdom to come.